So we've got three kind of topics or questions that we thought we'd look at. They're not the same as in the program. There's a slight change to them. And also I'm joined on stage by some experts from different areas, from industry, from the regulatory side, and from consultancy. And I'll just introduce us, and everybody will give a couple of minutes of their perspective and where they're coming from, and then we'll work our way through these questions. So I'll start, and then I'll just pass around the panel. So I'm Rod Robinson. I'm from National Physical Laboratory in the UK, and so we are a national measurement institute. So not surprisingly, my perspective on all of this is about the traceability and the uncertainty in measurements, in ensuring that we have comparable measurements, and the industry have the methods and the standardized methods that they can use to report. So I'm really keen on seeing the development both of the requirements for monitoring and the validation of methods to meet those needs. And I'll pass across to Matthew Williams.
Thanks, Rod. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Matthew Williams. I'm the methane emission reduction lead for National Grid Gas. So if you don't know National Grid Gas, we're the transmission system operator in the UK. We operate 8,500 kilometres of pipeline, 22 compressor stations and 2 terminals. My focus for my role is to lead our methane emission strategy, and that revolves around what an optimised leak detection and repair programme looks like, combining all of the periodic and continuous monitoring techniques that we've all heard about over the last 2 days, and also what methane emission reduction options we should be looking at, thinking about actual hard engineering and assets that we could deploy on our equipment to reduce methane emissions from operating the transmission system. Over to Manon.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'm Manon Simão. I'm a consultant in carbon limits. We are a small consulting company from Oslo, and we work on various aspects of climate change mitigation, including decarbonization of the oil and gas sector, which the topic that interests us all today, methane management and mitigation in the oil and gas sector. We work across the full value chain, so from supporting measurement campaigns, what are the measurement technologies, how do we put them in place, but also how does that relate to emissions on a greater scale, what does that mean for reconciliation that we've talked about, and what can we do then to use these to inform both ways. What does that mean in terms of emissions? How can we reduce them at a larger scale? And also taking the international standards and how can these be operationalized, and try to make the link between this very practical on the ground and also higher level, and trying to relate those between operators, regulators. And we work with all types of actors well represented here, so from private companies, regulators, international agencies, and also with a bit of research institutions and NGOs. On to you, Joana.
Thank you, Manon. So my name is Joana. I am a lawyer in the European Commission. I've been working on energy policy for a few years now, but I've only got into the methane topic last year, and I've been working on the legislative proposal for a regulation to reduce methane emissions in the energy sector. Some of you may have heard a bit about it yesterday. So my key piece here, or my perspective here as a regulator, is based exactly on that proposal, and measurement and all the stuff we have been hearing quite a bit about in these days was the the key pillar or the first pillar for the regulation. So the main driver for it to come into place was really the lack of data and how much methane emissions are still based on emission factors, like Jasmine, for example, from ICL told us about yesterday. So what we tried to do with the regulation was to look at what was already in place in terms of measurement. In here, the key element was obviously the OGMP 2.0, and to make it mandatory. So to build from that and to really require source level and site level measurements for operators. And if I can just add a bit of a context or geopolitical point here, for us, the way we see measurement, we see it as important not just from the environmental point of view to know how much methane we are emitting into the atmosphere, but also from the economic point of view, how much gas our infrastructures are actually wasting. And if we look at the current situation and how much the EU is still dependent on fossil fuels and how much we are trying to unlock from countries like Russia, all of this is very important. All of that we can capture back to our networks is very important. I think it was the IEA last year that published some data estimating that if all the leaks globally in 2021 had been captured, we would have an extra 180 BCM to use. And if we think that the EU exports, I think last year was around 150 BCM, we understand the magnitude of the problem and how much we can actually harness this for our networks. Over to you, Trond.
Thank you. So I'm Trond Bustnes. I work for Equinor, and I have much the same role as Peter, I suppose, does in BP. I'm basically supposed to be making sense out of where the measurement side of things is heading, and finding out what Equinor as a company is meant to implement in terms of technologies for quantification, for measurement. Equinor is a member of OGMP, like many other companies, and I think the idea of improving the transparency and the accuracy of the way methane is reported is important. So I think the base of where we're starting from is important in the OGMP, but I also think I also see that there's a lot of movement on a lot of different fronts. The regulatory front is moving very fast. The offerings from companies are becoming more and more, but it's quite chaotic. There is perhaps not the kind of groundwork in terms of standards and in terms of ways of qualifying technology that we might like to see before companies jump on a bandwagon, because that basically leaves everybody bewildered as to what it is that works, what it is that works well, and what it is that works less well. And I think in that landscape, it's quite tricky to navigate. Of course, with time, all of these will be more grounded. All of these elements will be more grounded. But things are moving fast, and that's good. Although it's important to kind of keep the sequence straight in that game, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. The first question that we had was, and we've heard in a number of the presentations around the underlying driver for all of this is, of course, not to measure methane, it's to reduce methane. And so I guess the first topic was around, what's the best mechanism and what's the best way to achieve that and drive that. And I think I'll hand over to Joana to start up on this topic.
I think this is where I need to prepare to face the music, because I'll talk about the regulation and about the parts that have been getting a lot of feedback. If I I should probably say feedback instead of pushback from the from the industry. So yeah, well, reporting and reducing. So reporting and reducing, or even reporting, monitoring, verifying, and reducing is really the crux of the regulation. And in terms of reports, what we have is nothing new. It's annual measurement reports, as I said before, source level and site level, and an obligation also to make this information available to the public. And also very importantly, to have this information verified by third parties. So we have here new actors, independent verifiers, the IMEO, to really make sure that the data we're looking at is accurate. And here I can go back to, I think it was Peter's point yesterday. What about standards? What do? We should be harmonizing this information. We should all be working in the same way. It's true that there's work ongoing for that. Rod also mentioned that yesterday, and we are aware of that in the regulation, which is also why we have a provision for a delegated act to develop on this and to make sure that when verifiers are working, they're working against the same standards. Now I know it's not the same as an ISO or SEN, and it's not a fast track, but it's still a forum, it's still an opportunity to bring people together and to work together. Some of you may know that delegated acts are approved by expert groups, so very much like OGMP groups, for example. This is where we can have different people in the same room and trying to harmonize a bit the information. Now, for reduction, what we have is an obligation to do leak detection and repair surveys to repair leaks as well. We have a ban on venting and routine flaring with specific exemptions for situations of emergency, malfunction, or where absolutely unavoidable. And then we have sort of a cascading principle where we give preference to capturing the gas. Then if this is not, or reusing it, re-injecting it, if this is not feasible, flaring, if this is not feasible, venting. So it's a bit the way we've thought about it. And here, I mean, again, we're completely open to the views of everyone in the room and beyond, and we have had a lot of workshops in that direction to improve the proposal. But our struggle here, which is always the struggle of the regulator, was to find the sweet spot in a way between not being too prescriptive, but also not being too flexible to the point of just leaving things as they are on the basis of voluntary schemes and the good faith of the industry. So this is, yeah, we've tried to reach a good matrix of things, but the proposal is certainly not perfect, and we are open to suggestions to improve it, bearing in mind that it is now in negotiations between the Council and the European Parliament, so the role the Commission has is also not unlimited.
There's been a lot of discussion and very healthy debate, I think, about the methane regulation. Obviously, from my perspective, from a UK operator not being part of the European Union anymore, has obviously been quite an interesting dynamic for us, particularly as we've been involved in discussions with the development of the regulation through our involvement in market gas and our membership of GIE, but it's just been slightly interesting to see, because the regulation at the moment, although it will apply to us, and we've had discussions, Joana, about the whole natural gas supply chain and how, although we're not in the European Union, our transmission system is directly connected through interconnectors to the European gas network. So by default, we will get captured by the regulation. And I think we, as an industry, we fully support the aims and objectives of the regulation around transparent reporting. We've had some discussion and debate around what a balanced and effective leak detection program looks like, and how prescriptive the regulation is. I won't go into the details of that, but you know, we're all, like Trond said, grappling with very quickly developing measurement and detection solutions, and exactly what blend of those different measurement and leak detection solutions we deploy as operators. And I think the regulation definitely needs to give us the flexibility to still innovate and deploy new technologies as they come on stream in the years to come. Specifically on reducing methane emissions from from a midstream transmission operator perspective, you know, obviously you can't work to reduce your methane emission footprint unless you fully understand where all your methane emissions are coming from in your operation. So that's something we've been doing very actively over the last probably 12 months specifically, actually, and what's one of my roles. So just as an example, you know, 40 still from operating the UK transmission system, 44% of our methane emissions come from venting. So we have been looking at what recompression solutions, specifically you talked about eliminate or reducing methane emissions. We've been looking at how we can work with the big compressor machinery train OEMs, Siemens, Solar, Baker Hughes, as to how we can deploy their recompression solutions to kind of eliminate that very large pot of methane from operating our network, and also mobile recompression as well, from where we're having to isolate length of our pipeline. You know, we still vent. It's much smaller. I think it's only about 12% of our methane emissions footprint comes from pipeline venting, but there are, you know, engineering solutions now out there that would allow us to virtually eliminate that. So where there are quick wins to reduce and eliminate methane emissions, we're doing that. And then obviously looking at leak detection as well, where we've historically only had a very limited leak detection program, how we expand that to get a better visibility of fugitives and on our network. I think I'll leave it there. I don't know if Trond or...
No, I think
Manon.
you were making a very fair point, and Joana touched a bit about it, the importance of reporting, but also not waiting for the perfect reporting to be in place, because that might not happen. It will take too much time to have all 100% of the information. It's essential to know where to focus efforts, but making sure to continue having, and that's what you were saying, reductions happening in parallel before even a perfect reporting solution is in place, because if that takes another year, 10 years, a year is maybe okay, but 10 years, reductions need to happen before that.
So I have a metrology background, as Rod will probably know. So, you know, seeking perfection should not be a barrier to progress. You know, if there's something, you're better off measuring something and trying to understand something that you don't know and deploying something that we can then work on and develop and improve. Is kind of where I'm at on that. I fully agree.
But a big challenge to translate that into regulation, which by design needs to have some barriers.
Yeah, and even for reporting, at some point you need to be able to live with a certain level of for measuring and reporting with a certain level of uncertainty, where you say it's good enough. We'll continue on this basis. Sorry, Trond, I don't know if you were...
No, that's good. I mean, I think part of the fast-moving field, of course, is technology offerings. I mean, you mentioned it, that they're moving fast. And here among you are a lot of people who actually want to come to the market with both the leak detection side of things and with the quantification side of things. And both of those are really important. And I think one plea or one input to the regulatory process is that it doesn't present hindrances to that. That it's actually the barriers to entry into that side of things is low, so that companies can come in, they can think up new principles, new ways of doing things, and they can actually enter into that space. If the methodologies are specified for how to do things in the legislation, that almost automatically becomes a barrier to entry when it comes to new technologies and new ways and methods. And I think that's where, you know, let alone choosing now, but also knowing on what premises to choose your technologies is just not there quite yet, and this is where it's quite important to find focus in that area. In my view, that doesn't mean that legislation can't be prescriptive, legislation can't be ambitious, but it might need to have a slightly different angle to it, and set the requirements in a slightly different way.
Yeah. So the goal, just to say, maybe reassuring, the goal was always to be, or the spirit of the legislator, if you will, was always to be technology agnostic. So it was always to be able to leave that space to the technology providers, to the service providers. Maybe we didn't quite get that right. It's yet, but yeah, definitely willing to work towards that.
And I think, just picking up on what you said there, Trond, certainly within the standardization side, and this is what I'd be hoping for from the regulations, is that they set the kind of performance requirements so we have the pull on what's needed, but not the technologies, not the definitions. And the kind of standards that we set would, again, be setting performance standards, so that hopefully new technologies can demonstrate that they're capable, they're equivalent to those standards. And also we put in place, I think as Clay was saying, the kind of infrastructure to allow that testing to be done in a way which is comparable, so that industry can look to the technology providers and be sure that what they are delivering, what they say, and what they're delivering meets the requirements of the regulations. So yeah, I think that's a kind of position that I'd like to see in the kind of the perfect regulation, would be setting the targets and then allowing the market to meet to deliver the solutions. It's interesting, picking up on what you said, Matthew, around some of the initial wins will be potentially in changing the structure, because you'll be reducing, changing the way your compressors are operating, so you've got low venting. And that leads us on to the second point here, which is, as we do identify the low-hanging fruit, identifying the areas for immediate reduction, we're going to change the methane space. And the question then is, particularly to the measurement providers out there, what are the new challenges going to be? And what are the problems going to be in chasing that? And Trond, did you have a...
Yeah, so to that, I have one point which is to say that, first of all, I think it's very good and very important that it's quite clear now that there is a market for methane measurement. That's not going to go away, at least not soon. So in that respect, it's a good sort of impetus for providers of technologies and methods to actually come in and invest and on their own front, which is great. I think, though, that also this question of understanding what the methane emissions are, what the sources are, how big they are, how they vary with activity, how they vary, for each individual site, for operators to understand what's going on, it's been mentioned. That understanding will progress, and I suppose we could see a future where we go through like an increase in measurements that are at a site level and a source level. We can see high activity, and then we can see that the understanding of what's going on actually improves over time. So things just start slotting into, well, this is how we do this kind of measurement and source quantification, and this is how we do that kind of source quantification, and it works every time because we understand what's going on now. So moving through that curve of intense activity for a number of years, maybe 5 to 10 years, until we end up at a point where people understand what's going on, then it becomes much more of a standard and low effort thing. And I think getting through that curve is going to be interesting, to say the least. But we as operators need help, for sure.
And I think that's the point where you can start categorizing things, and you can start putting targets or performance standards, because that's when you have a full understanding and accurate picture of what's going on, and you can say, okay, now I can reduce so and so. We're not there yet, but that's the point where you can start thinking of things in those terms.
I think it's probably how this conference could probably develop as well, Rod. I think we had a bit of a taste of it really from Total earlier, around how they're taking measurement of methane emissions, and actually how that measurement is leading to actual reduction in methane emissions. I think that would be really powerful, because that's why all the academics and scientists in the room are undertaking measurements, is so we can actually deliver some actual reduction. So I think that would be very good sort of next step really for the conference itself.
Yeah, so a challenge to the industry in the room is next time tell us what you've achieved and how you've achieved it.
And also what will be interesting for the industry in the years to come, as you were saying, there is a market for it. But now we also see the scale of the deployment of these technologies that needs to take place in the coming years with OGMP, with EU regulation requiring more and more of these measurements, of this quantification at both source level and site level. And so it's to also be able to scale up that market to make sure that the need of companies to both have access to these technologies, to deploy these technologies, is also met. So to be able to both fill in this market with adapted technologies, but also to be able to fill in the volume of the market that might emerge from these developments.
And I appreciate that Matt stepped in at the last minute when Tanya couldn't make it and actually has to rush for a train. So were there any last comments you wanted to make?
We could kind of touch on a couple of things. I think whole value chain methane emission reduction is quite important at the moment. From my own perspective, as the UK transmission system at the moment, we are currently today exporting 30% of all natural gas which is coming into the transmission system in the UK to support natural gas supply and topping up of storage within the European Union in the context of everything that's going on. So clearly, whole value chain, sort of determining whole value chain methane emissions are very important now. And also, the measurement world is probably going to have to think about, particularly around methane emissions, that the natural gas system is not going to be 90, whatever it is now, 94% methane in natural gas. That's going to change. We don't know sort of the pace of change in terms of hydrogen injection is not exactly set yet, but we expect blending into the UK transmission system, for example, to begin around 2025. And I think just there might be measurement challenges around, hydrogen detection and measurement in the future, and just starting to think about that. But I'll have to bow out there. So thank you for having me on stage, Rod.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. I think one of the things that I could see changing with the methane space is just the move towards smaller, more distributed sources. I mean, we heard the talk on the attempt to identify and locate leaks from the distribution system, but as we move to smaller sources, to more distributed production and power, to potentially to biogas and small AD plants, etc., then the measurement problem becomes more dispersed, and we're looking then at identifying not within sort of large infrastructure that Peter talked about, but maybe smaller distributed sources and farm-based production, and that becomes a different measurement challenge, and certainly then cost effectiveness becomes an issue as well. But passing across, if there's any thoughts about the future kind of space.
In the future methane space in general, and this is something that has been touched upon a bit, there's a question of transparency, which is becoming increasing. And we know that a lot of this transparency is actually industry-driven, with companies taking part in initiatives like OGMP or GTI to really be able to report on a transparent level. What's also interesting is that there is a sort of technology-driven transparency that is starting to appear more and more. We see it, and some people have talked about it a bit, satellites coming into play, or site-level measurements, which are actually then being able to pinpoint, let's say, whether some companies or regions want to have this level of transparency or not. It's driven by technology now, which then also pushes players to have a closer look at their emissions and sort of to anticipate this level of transparency they might not necessarily have wanted before. So forcing them to, at a site level, be able to anticipate that, be able to identify, to make sure that these don't happen. And that's where also where detection and quantification methodologies come in, for them to be able to explain these transparency issues, to be able to, once it's out in the public, to be able to have some kind of good reason, or to be able to even anticipate these events, and that will also, transparency will help to drive reduction in the future.
Yeah, with that in mind, one of the provisions of the regulation is precisely to set up a global monitoring tool using the satellite and harnessing already the EU's capacity in terms of satellite imaging, precisely to get that picture as well, and to inform even bilateral, multilateral dialogues of the Commission with other countries that have perhaps a higher methane intensity. And ideally, this would all, as Trond was saying before, there's a lot of noise now, a lot of new technologies coming in, but once this stabilizes, ideally this would be done together with the initiatives of the IMEO on ultra emitters, for example. All of this, at the end of the day, is merging into the same goal, which is to have that transparency, to have that accurate picture. I don't think that satellites will substitute other instruments. I don't think anyone thinks that, but they are becoming more and more precise. When we talk about units of 5 kilos per hour with methane set, this is impressive. It's very, very. It makes us hopeful that all of these instruments combined will really just give a pristine picture of methane emissions.
I was just going to say a slightly different perspective in terms of future is also that a lot of sources of methane emissions today are known and although they're really very difficult to do something about, also from the gas industry. And I think that that side of things comes back to focus in design and redesign, and focus in when it comes to how plants are configured. So new infrastructure, for example, will probably see different design going in to actually take care of some of those methane emission sources. Yet again, you know, there are, once you have contained methane, it's sometimes hard to avoid emissions, and so I don't really believe that the emissions will ever truly be zero, but that if the aim and the work towards that gets a different focus level, then there will certainly be significant changes in the next 5 or 10 years. Also, like this is aside from leak detection, it's aside from unexpected emissions that happen, that you need to deal with. It's to do with the stuff that you know actually from the day you start planning infrastructure, that you will be emitting through the lifetime of a system, and I think that is. That's something where there will also be innovation, and there's need for innovation. There's need for new ways of doing things, new ways of doing maintenance where you don't actually have to do this. So there's space there too, not just in detection and measurement, but also in design aspects.
And do you think there's a possibility the danger of a kind of laser focus on the existing sources, that we track those down smaller and smaller and smaller because we've got that focus, but then we forget the other sources which currently aren't being controlled, and at some point we need to step back to look at kind of the bigger picture and you know, the difficult sources, agriculture, and some of the ones which are harder to regulate. I'm just curious how you see maybe the regulations being able to adapt to a changing methane space.
I think you just made an argument for being prescriptive rather than risk-based, so that's good. Because indeed, if we start to focus on the more obvious sources, on the bigger sources, that's great, and it's good that we address those. But we should not forget all the others that may be unexpected or that may be smaller, which is, the way I see it, a case for being more prescriptive and really requiring a cross check of all your sources. And then, yeah, on agriculture and waste, it's a whole different sector and a whole different consideration. On waste, for example, there has been a lot of reduction of methane emissions, not necessarily because the methane emissions had been looked at, but because there was so much work on landfills and so on that naturally those emissions came down. So, lucky them.
Yeah, I think it will be a luxury problem if we're all down to the small sources in the oil and gas sector. It's true that now it is getting a lot of focus because it is a sector where it's, as we've discussed, definitely not perfectly characterized, but we do have a good sense, as Trond was saying, of where those emissions come from, of how to deal with them. The technology exists to actually deal with it. The technology exists. Maybe it's not deployed fully yet, but it exists to quantify, to identify those emission sources and to reduce them. But once we will, and we know it's cost effective to do so typically, or one of the sectors where it's cheaper to tackle these methane emissions, but once we will have gone, and again this needs to happen in parallel to not just generate other issues, but once methane emissions from the oil and gas has become less of a problem, it's true that it's very necessary to look into how can we take lessons learned from this sector and apply it to other sectors that maybe have had less work and less characterization of their methane emissions so far. So definitely, whether it be in the energy sector or agriculture or waste management, there are definitely lessons to be learned and things to be applied there as well to try to accelerate the process?
I think the focus that the industry has had on safety has a lot of learning points when it comes to methane emissions as well. I mean, they don't go necessarily hand in hand in the sense that you can emit, you know, from the environmental viewpoint, you can emit quite a lot of methane and still have a safety-conscious culture, but the focus that you put in a company on or that has been in companies on safety for decades, that kind of focus can also be applied to methane emissions, and I think with the right methodology and the right approach and the right attitudes in companies, the right focus, then it's possible to do a lot with the methane sources that are there. Now there is a lot of focus, and I think there's more to come. I think it's also necessary to get that down to all levels of all organizations. Still work to be done, of course.
And I think a lot of the technologies that we've got and a lot of the methods are already being used and are applicable to these other sectors and to the other measurement challenges. Apart from hydrogen, which of course has no dipole and therefore no infrared absorption. So many of the technologies we've heard about won't work for hydrogen emissions. And clearly there's a lot of work going on at the moment to try and identify cost-effective ways of quantifying hydrogen emissions, which does have potentially a second-order sort of atmospheric impact. So that certainly is something we're considering adding into future versions of this conference, is a little bit about how we measure some of those particularly hydrogen emissions. But I guess one of the reasons for these questions that I had as a purely selfish thing was, well, if we run another one of these conferences and it's in a year and a half or 2 years' time, will we have solved the problem? And I'm guessing not by then.
So I think, I mean, there's the mitigation side of things, which we talked about for a while now. But one of the things that I think we've seen yesterday and today, which I think is very important, is that the accuracy of the measurement that we've seen is not good enough, really. And I think that side of things, of course, we'll see a lot of development. But I think, you know, when we aim for measurement, and you know, we had it in the question of the coal mine vents yesterday, where the question is, you know, do you do your measurement in the actual duct before it's let out to atmosphere, or do you do it afterwards? And I think, you know, it's a harder problem once you're away from a source to measure accurately, and I think that's something that it needs addressing. Knowing what is actually driving the inaccuracy of measurement and dealing with those factors to get these measurement methods to actually produce what we're aiming for. Being out by orders of magnitude, an order of magnitude, even a factor 2 or 3, for the sake of actually knowing how much you release, might not quite be good enough. And then, you know, we're not just talking like 2, 5, 10% here. Often we're talking much more in the methods that get tested, and they're tested under controlled conditions, which is not necessarily the same as in the field, as we also see the contours of knowing. So really, you know, that kind of identifying and reducing, and then working on the measurement problem is really something that needs to go side by side. And I don't think that measurement problem in itself is going to be wholly solved in 2 years' time if there's another conference. So, seeing those error bars shrink by an order of magnitude would be nice.
So there's the challenge to the measurement providers, the uncertainty. Not only do we have to define what the uncertainty is and how we calculate it, but it's got to come down by several orders, or at least an order, which I think is true. And I think the other issue, which I keep referring to, and I think we'll see this evolve, there's not one measurement challenge in terms of methane. There's not one measurement of methane that we all are targeting. There are different needs for measurement, and therefore there are different solutions we need to develop.
And it will definitely be interesting to see how the ecosystem of solution develops, because we know that depending on flow rates, depending on detection levels, depending on if we're looking at a source, if we're looking at an equipment, if we're looking at a site, what kind of ecosystem can be deployed to capture the emissions and to reduce uncertainty while taking all these different characteristics of the different emission sources and emission points to take them in their globality and to be able to capture all of it. There won't be a one-size-fits-all for any of these.
And I guess another area would be, if we're looking at mitigation, is actually how we certify or how we prove the mitigation approaches, and particularly if we're looking at technologies which are aiming to destroy or reduce methane. I mean, clearly there's been one that's been used by default for years, which is flaring, and we're still discussing whether that is actually achieving the efficiencies in under all conditions. And so clearly there's a need for validating any of the mitigation technologies that come in as well.
Primary mitigation, of course, is never to let it out in the first place.
Yeah. Indeed. And there's a lot of room for being creative there. I was just reading last week of a startup that is setting, so it's Bitcoin, and they're setting their site close to oil production sites so that they can use the excess gas to power their data centers, their data mining centers. I'm not advocating for Bitcoin or NFTs or any of those things, but creativity is welcome, and if we can, I mean, capturing is much better. If you can reuse it instead of flaring or venting it, by all means.
And as we heard earlier today, potentially we've got negative emission destruction of methane. But certainly direct capture of greenhouse gases is another area where we're struggling to work out how you validate those. I'm sensing we're kind of wrapping up our discussions here. I had another little question which isn't on the screen, which really was just to ask the panel if there's one kind of aspect either you've got from the conference or that's your sort of key issue that you think would be the burning question or something which you have got to take home from.
Right. So I think my burning question in that sense, maybe, I mean, I have many, of course, so it's really hard to kind of pick the one. But my question really is whether measurement is going to deliver in terms of quantification. I don't have much doubt that it's going to deliver in terms of detection, but whether it's going to deliver in terms of quantification to the level that we want to see, I'm not entirely sure. That's
a burning question. On my end, I learned immensely being in this world not that long, but I was in a way reassured that the regulatory incentive and the factoring in compliance costs and regulatory costs into the whole context of what to do with when we measure, when we mitigate, there's a place for it, and it's welcomed, regardless whether we are pushing more for flexibility or for prescription. It's that kind of certainty and that kind of push is welcome. So that was is reassuring.
Yeah, on my side, to wrap up, I'll try to make a bit of a hopeful analogy. So here we've been seeing a lot of work being done mainly in North America and in Europe. But of course, there are all the other countries and world regions that are also producing oil and gas. And we can see this a bit as the zero waste movement. So we see some families that manage to end up at the end of the year with just one jar of waste, and that's everything they've done. And these people are essential. They're the ones that are raising awareness. They're the ones that are looking into creative solutions. What can be done? How do we take this theory, this thing that everyone wants to do but isn't really put into practice? We all want to reduce waste. We all want to reduce methane emissions, to quantify them properly. How do we put that in practice? They might be the ones writing a book that will inspire the others. But what we see is that if we want large-scale global impact, these few families that have their jar of waste at the end of the year will drive the movement. But where a municipality will actually see impact in their waste statistics, where they will see that they need to run their incinerator less, is when all households in a city go from having, on average, 3 trash bags that they need to take out every week down to 1. And so it's very important to have these players that quantify, that reconciliate properly, to lead the way, to show where can we have an impact, find practical solutions to be able to test out. But then, so to have these players that are zero methane or close to zero methane, but what's really important is also to be able to share that beyond to all other players, so that all players at least reach low methane, and then see where we can take it from there, so that, because in the end it's all the same atmosphere, so the methane, and it's important to have those leading the way, but to also be able to apply these solutions, these technologies, and to have them available for all players to be able to have things change on a greater scale.
Here, and I think what you've said there, Manon, really feeds into my challenge to industry then for our next conference is to come and share that best practice and share the wins and explain how and what you've done and how you've demonstrated that we've got these reductions. And I would also pick up on what Trond said, the challenge to the measurement community. But clearly, I think if we give the measurement community goals, if we say this is the level of uncertainty we need for quantification of a particular scale of site, then we can work towards that and we can develop the tools to validate against that. Yeah. But if we leave it as an open, well, we can measure methane, but there's no challenge at the moment to do that to a certain level of uncertainty, then we won't drive the innovation. So we probably have to set some targets and maybe some quite ambitious targets in terms of the uncertainty levels to go for. So we've all got our work cut out before we come back and meet again to discuss this. So I'd like to thank the panel. I think that's been a really interesting, well, it's been interesting sitting up here. I don't know if everyone out there has found it interesting. But and again, thank you to everyone who stayed the course. I mean, it's amazing to look out on a conference at the end of 2 days and still have only a few empty seats. And I'm pretty sure they haven't been removing the empty seats so that it's been reducing. So thanks, everyone. And again, I'd just like to say thank you to all the organisers. Thank you to the scientific committee for helping put together this. Thanks to the conference organisers, thanks to the session chairs, thanks again to all the speakers. I mean, it's been an absolutely brilliant conference. I've really enjoyed all the talks, learned a lot. Thanks again to the panel. Thanks to Anne-Marie, wherever she's run off to. And hopefully we'll see you again.
And thanks to you, Rod, as well, for chairing this.
Thank you. And thanks to the sound guy who actually